The Stevenson Trust for Citizenship exists to promote informed public debate about the choices we as citizens, not only as voters or taxpayers, but as participants in a shared civic project. Our lectures are intended to fulfill Sir Daniel Stevenson's remit to us and bridge the gap between expert analysis and public understanding, to illuminate how policy decisions shape everyday lives, and to do so in a way that invites both scrutiny, but actually not so much deference. Tonight's lecture could hardly be better aligned with that mission then. In May 2026, Scotland will elect a new parliament, and shortly thereafter, we will have a new government. Whoever forms that government will inherit a set of tax and spending choices that are simultaneously constrained, complex, and exposed to risk. Demographic change, pressures on health and social care, climate commitments, public service expectations, and the realities of a devolved fiscal framework collide in the next parliamentary term. And these are not abstract challenges. They will determine what parties can realistically promise during the campaign, what they can afford to protect whilst in Parliament, and where different trade-offs will need to be considered. Tonight's lecture asks a deceptively simple question. What does the fiscal landscape look like for the next Scottish government, and what does that mean for the choices ahead? This is not pitched in the language of manifestos or slogans, but in the language of evidence, constraint, and consequence. In a political culture that often treats budgets in a boo-rah, annual ritual sort of way, this is an opportunity to step back and look at the underlying pressures shaping Scotland's public finances over the next Parliament and beyond. So we are exceptionally fortunate to have Professor Graeme Roy to guide us through that terrain. Professor Roy is chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the independent body charged with producing Scotland's official economic and fiscal forecasts and with assessing the sustainability of the public finances. In that role, he sits at the intersection of economics and democratic accountability, providing analysis that informs budgets, legislation, and public debate, while remaining deliberately outside party politics. Professor Roy is an assistant vice principal and deputy head of College of Social Sciences here at the University of Glasgow. He is a former civil servant in the Scottish government, where he was head of the First Minister's Policy Unit, and he has served as the director of the Fraser of Allen Institute. So Professor Roy has advised governments, spoken regularly to the media, and crucially for us tonight, he has a rare ability to explain complex fiscal issues in a way that is clear, grounded, and candid. I'll just say quickly before turning it over to Professor Roy that we are recording tonight's lecture, and if you choose to participate in the Q&A, just know that your voice will be captured in that recording. So with that, can you please join me in welcoming Professor Graeme Roy to deliver tonight's Stevenson Trust lecture.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Great. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks, Chris, for that introduction, and also the challenge of trying to explain fiscal issues in a simplistic manner as possible. And one thing you'll see from my chat about the Scottish budget and how it works in Scotland's fiscal framework is that it is certainly not that straightforward to unpick how everything works. So what I want to do in the discussion this evening is do two key things for you. The second part, which is the bit that I really want to focus on towards the end, is around just discussing some of the pressures on the tax and spending side that the future Scottish government will face post-May's election, whoever forms that government. But in order to do that, you have to understand how Scotland's budget works and some of the constraints and pressures that the Scottish Government faces in trying to manage its priorities. So if you don't mind, I'll walk you through the joys of Scotland's fiscal framework. I'll talk to you about the Barnett formula, block grant adjustments, reconciliations, but hopefully that gives you a broad overview about how the budget works. And then you can start to see some of the challenges that will face the next government in terms of balancing all of those different elements. So, how does the Scottish budget work? So, how does the Scottish Government, when it starts to think about setting out the days before significant tax and spending devolution, the way that the Scottish budget was determined was supposedly relatively simple. Now, I know Professor Heald here will question that about how simplistic it was and all some of the shenanigans that went on about determining Scotland's budget, but certainly compared to the situation we have now, it was relatively straightforward. And the main mechanism that determined how much the current Scottish Government have, so if you call it the Scottish Government, previously the Scottish Executive, or going all the way back to the Scottish Office pre-devolution, was that the budget was determined by primarily something called the Barnett formula. That was the key mechanism through which the Scottish block grant, the Scottish grant was determined, and that was how much the Scottish Government would have to spend. And the way the Barnett formula worked was relatively straightforward. So what it said essentially was, okay, the way that we funded you last year was through some form of block grant. So a fiscal transfer from Westminster to the Scottish Government or the Scottish Executive or the old Scottish Office. So there's a block grant that came through last year. And what the Barnett formula did was to say, we're not going to look at the block grant from last year, but what we're now going to focus upon is how that block grant might change year on year. And the Barnett formula was essentially designed to be a mechanism that would try and adjust that budget year on year for the different spending choices that governments across the UK would take. A bit of an aside, so it was Joel Barnett who it was named after. So Joel Barnett was the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the 1970s. And there's a great quote from him about when he was giving evidence to the House of Lords, which was why he was wanting to come up with some mechanism. Why was there an agreement, or why was there some way of trying to get some mechanical way of adjusting the Scottish budget? And his reply was he just wanted to get home each night because the Scottish MPs, the Secretary of State of Scotland, was very good at lobbying and trying to get more money for Scotland. So this mechanism was designed to try and, as best as possible, bypass those difficult negotiations. And so the way the Barnett formula works is relatively straightforward. So you take the block grant from last year, and then you adjust it this year by a very simple formula. And the way it works is that essentially what you do is you look at the comparable spending in England or in England and Wales, depending upon the area of priority. So let's say that's education. You look at how much education spending is increasing in England, and all you then do is essentially work out a relative population share of that increase for the spending change in England and Wales. And essentially the Barnett formula then turns around is that calculation of how much the spending is changing in England and Wales multiplied by our population gives you something called a Barnett consequential. And it's the Barnett consequential that then determines how last year's budget changes into this year's budget. There's a thing there that I haven't mentioned yet called a comparability factor. That's largely just a mechanism to check how comparable the spending is relative to what is being devolved. So things like school education is 100%, it's 100% controlled in England, it's 100% controlled in Scotland, so the comparability factor is essentially 1 for 1. There are some areas of spending where that comparability factor might change in areas such as justice and the like, but it's pretty much determines that a change in spending in England and Wales or in England, depending on the nature of that spending, transfers through to spending in Scotland. So to give you an example, let's suppose that a UK government changes spending on education in England by uplifting it by £500 million. Let's suppose that's school education, so that's fully devolved here in Scotland, so the comparability factor is 100%. You just multiply that by Scotland's share of the relevant UK population. So in this case, Scotland's share of the English population, and that gives you a Barnett consequential. So the budget increases by the consequential relative to how much has been spent in England or in England and Wales, depending upon the spending element. And that then determines the block grant for next year. So the Barnett formula is a relatively straightforward, simple mechanism that would determine the amount of money that the Scottish Government would have to spend in each year by essentially taking last year's money and adjusting it for equivalent spending in England into the year ahead. So that was the mechanism that existed for determining the Scottish budget all the way up until we started having significant fiscal devolution on tax and social security. And the challenge is that you're now going to give the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, greater autonomy over revenues and spending, but clearly relying on a block grant is no longer going to cut it, because you're not just getting funding from a block grant, you're now getting funding from devolved revenues as well. And if you've got social security, that's going to potentially look at quite a different level of spending need comparable to population. So something had to change. The added complexity of this was that if you remember in the run-up to the independence referendum back in 2014, there was the vow, which front page of the Daily Record, promising lots of things for Scotland if it voted no. But in that very short text was a promise to maintain the Barnett formula. So you can see the challenges that then befell people trying to push through new devolution was you're going to have to find a mechanism that allows for the transfer of more fiscal and social security powers, but does so by retaining the Barnett formula. And how do you do that? And that's how we ended up with this complex fiscal framework that exists for Scotland. One final thing, of course, and I'll come on to this when I talk about taxes, is that the British government back in the early days of devolution had one tax, one national tax that they could. And you'll see how that changes over time in terms of relative prioritisation. But that was essentially the only tax that they could control. There's obviously council tax, but that is a local tax, and the Scottish Government shouldn't interfere with local taxation, and of course they don't. But the only major tax they had was non-domestic rates, and that would determine how much the Scottish Government would have to spend each year. Okay. So how have things changed, and how does the new framework constrain but also provide new opportunities for future Scottish governments, current Scottish Government to set fiscal policy and policy in a different way? So the first thing that happened after the transfer of fiscal power, so after the Smith Commission, was a transfer of a significant number of social security payments. So that was something that was underpinned in the Smith Commission to give the Scottish Parliament now new responsibilities over social security. And this was the first time in devolution that major social security powers have ever been transferred to a devolved administration. And broadly speaking, there was three key areas of social security that were transferred. So the first of these was a relatively small in terms of financial terms of areas linked to the regulated social fund. So that's things like funeral payments, cold weather payments, pension aid, heating payments, those sorts of things were transferred. But then there were big payments transferred that relate to disability and ill health, and they're the big ticket items that exist for the Scottish budget. So personal independence payments that exist in England and Wales, that was essentially switched off for Scotland. And now we have our own payment in Scotland called the adult disability payment. So a different payment system in Scotland relative to England and Wales. And then the third element, and a crucial element, is that Scottish Parliament now has the authority and the power to implement its own additional social security payments that don't exist anywhere else in the UK. So some payments have been transferred, but it can also implement its own payment if it wishes to. And I guess the most important, or the most significant one, or the most famous one of that is the Scottish Child Payment, which is a payment paid to families every week who are on universal credit, and that's to essentially top up their incomes. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the rest of the UK, and that's a payment that's unique to Scotland. So the Scottish Government now has the ability to put its own payments around Social Security, and that's what it's done gradually over the last 5 years or so as it's taken on additional responsibilities. And to give an idea about this, in total, we think this year it will be about £7.5 billion, rising to about £8 billion. So quite a chunky amount of spending that exists. So the obvious question is, well, how is this funded? So how is this fact that these are now payments being made in Scotland that are no longer essentially pulled from DWP, how does the Scottish Government have the money in order to deliver these payments in Scotland? And what happened was that essentially the Scottish Government now gets a transfer, an additional transfer on top of the Barnett formula, in order to essentially deliver the same level of benefit support as exists in England and Wales. So in other words, how much would it cost the DWP to deliver exactly the same payments they're delivering in England and Wales if they still delivered it in Scotland? And essentially a calculation is made about how much that would cost, and that money gets transferred to the Scottish Government, and they then spend it, and they can then decide to do it as they wish. So that's how the funding works. We're not very good as economists about giving things really exciting titles. So what happens is this thing called a block grant adjustment. Now, I'll keep coming back to block grant adjustments over and over again because they're one of the most important elements within the Scottish budget. Unfortunately, they don't have a nice name like the Barnett formula or anything like that. They're just called a block grant adjustment. And it does, a bit like Ronseal, it does exactly what it says in the tin. It adjusts the block grant for the fact that you now have these social security powers implemented in Scotland. So essentially, the Scottish Government get an additional payment on top of its block grant to account for the fact that payments that were being made by DWP for people in Scotland are now no longer being made by DWP. They're now being made here in Scotland by an organisation called Social Security Scotland. So what's the kind of fiscal implication of that? Well, the key fiscal implication for Scotland is essentially whether the Social Security block grant adjustments, so essentially the funding they receive to deliver the same, that is comparable to the same level of support as it would be in England and Wales, is greater or less than the delivery of the new Social Security system in Scotland. So, first of all, how much the new replacement benefits are costing, and then secondly, how much the payments unique to Scotland are costing as well. And the net effect of that is essentially the extra cost or the saving that the Scottish Government is making from Social Security. So essentially the funding is lagging behind how much is being spent in Scotland. Then essentially the Scottish Government have to find that money from somewhere else within the budget or find ways of raising revenue. If instead the Scottish Government is spending less than the funding they're receiving, they could then spend that money on something else. And I'll show you what the trend is in that later on when we look at some of the constraints and some of the challenges. So that's Social Security. So the other thing that happened was the transfer of tax powers to the Scottish Parliament. So as I said, way back in the start of devolution, the only national tax essentially the government could control was non-domestic rates or business rates, to give it its more popular name. The Scotland Act in 2012, after the Calman Commission, suggested we get some more tax powers, some modest variation around income tax, land and buildings transaction tax, fully devolved, that's about £1 billion. So that's if you buy a home in Scotland, you don't pay stamp duty anymore. What you do is you pay something else called land and buildings transaction tax, and that's collected here in Scotland. And landfill tax is a tax taxed on the commercial transfer of waste into landfill. There are two other smaller taxes that are still on the horizon to come through. Aggregates levy, so essentially taking aggregates out the ground. And within a couple of years, if you're fortunate enough to go on holiday the tax you pay on your flight will now be a devolved tax that will be delivered here in Scotland. So air departure tax will now be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and it'll come in. So that was after Calman, but the really big changes came in when the Smith Commission and the Scotland Act in 2016 essentially pushed through significant transfer of income tax powers to the Scottish Parliament. And what that of income tax on earned income. So essentially, if you receive a salary or you receive a pension, then essentially the tax that you now pay will be essentially allocated to the Scottish budget. There are some restrictions of what the Scottish Government can do with income tax. So it doesn't include savings, for example. It doesn't include dividends taxation. It also doesn't include the definition of income. So you couldn't turn around and say, in Scotland, we're going to tax people with beards, for example, more than people without beards. The definition of income is reserved to Westminster, and the starting point you pay tax is also reserved to Westminster through the personal allowance. But for everything else, the Scottish Government can choose to set rates and bands in any which way they like. And again, when I talk about some of the policy constraints and some of the challenges and opportunities, we'll look at how those rates have evolved in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. Okay, so you've now got powers over income tax. How does that feed through into the total amount of money, the funding that the Scottish Government has got at its disposal each year? So just in the same way as the Social Security block grant adjustment adds money to the Scottish budget, so adds money to the Barnett block grant, what happens with taxation is essentially the mirror of it, the flip of it, and essentially there's another block grant adjustment, but that removes money away from the Scottish budget. And essentially the way it works is that the Scottish Government gets to keep the revenues that are raised in Scotland, but then there's an adjustment to the block grant to account for the fact that those revenues are now flowing into Scotland rather than flowing into the UK Exchequer and therefore into UK-wide expenditure. So there's similarly, in the exact same way as there's an adjustment for Social Security, there's an adjustment for taxation as well, but this time it's a negative adjustment to account for the fact that the Scottish Government is getting to keep these revenues rather than essentially these being revenues that are pooled across the UK as a whole. And Scottish Government get to keep these tax revenues. Tax block adjustments adjust the budget down for that, and then we'll come on to, I'll show you what happens, what's the net effect of that, whether it's positive or negative over time. But the key thing I think to understand at this stage about whether or not this is good or bad news for the Scottish budget is to really understand how these tax block grant adjustments interact with Scottish tax revenues. And the way they did it was on day one, they'd say, right, okay, we're going to now give you these tax powers in Scotland. So we're going to make you no better or worse off. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you, let's say, £10 billion of income tax revenues, and we'll adjust your block grant, but downwards by £10 billion as well. So the net effect is zero. There's been no impact upon your budget in the very first year. So the question is, well, what happens in the second year, in year 3, in year 4, in year 5, and onwards? Well, if you're just taking out how much from the block grant as you're raising in revenue, you haven't really done anything. You've not really changed your level of fiscal powers because you're taking with one hand and putting back in with the other. So what they did was they said, right, okay, we know that the Scottish tax revenues are going to grow at the pace of tax revenue growth in Scotland. So what we're going to do is grow the block grant adjustments by the pace of tax growth in the rest of the UK. So you've got one that's growing at the rate of growth in Scotland, the other growing at the rate of growth elsewhere in the UK, so primarily England. And hopefully you can start to see the calculation that works out whether or not Scotland wins or loses under this framework. And if we can grow our tax revenues faster than tax revenues are growing in the rest of the UK, that net tax position is positive. We get to keep the additional revenue. If, on the other hand, the tax revenues in the rest of the UK are growing faster than tax revenues in Scotland, then that tax net position is going to be negative, and we're going to be worse off as a result. So what matters then is how we're doing relative to the UK. So this is a really fundamental point about the fiscal framework that faces the Scottish Government. It's not just about how much revenue is raised in Scotland, it's how it does relative to the rest of the UK. That's the crucial bit about whether or not devolution, fiscal devolution, is positive or negative for the Scottish budget. And that's dependent on a couple of things. It's dependent clearly on policy choices. So if you choose to tax people more in Scotland than the rest of the UK, then Scottish tax revenues are going to grow more quickly than the rest of the UK. Equally, if our economy does better than the rest of the UK, then Scotland gets to keep the additional revenues as a result of that. And what we'll see, as you'll see, you can think about some of the challenges here, is that anything that has a negative asymmetric impact on the Scottish economy relative to the UK is a risk within this framework. So things like the downturn in oil and gas in the northeast, the rest of the UK has got the City of London in their favour to try and grow revenues, and Scotland must match that performance in order for that tax net position to be at the very least not negative. Okay, so Scottish tax revenues less the block grant adjustments determine what happens to the net tax position. So how does all this come together in the Scottish budget process? So we start, Barnett still exists. Remember, it was promised that would be the case in the vow. So the Barnett formula still exists. That determines how the block grant is changing. On top of that block grant, get added a series of block grant adjustments for Social Security. So the fact that PIP is no longer delivered in Scotland, we get essentially the equivalent funding to deliver the same benefit as PIP north of the border. At the same time, the tax BGAs, the tax block grant adjustments, adjust for the fact that the Scottish Government is now collecting these revenues. That pulls money away from the block grant at the rate of growth as tax in the rest of the UK. That gives you a net position in the block grant. And what the Scottish Government can then do is add back in the devolved tax revenues. Okay, so that's essentially how the Scottish budget is determined. Barnett, the mixture of adjustments to Barnett to account for the fact that you've got devolution, and then the relative performance of the Scottish decisions in the Scottish economy that are impacting on taxation and the social security elements. Oh, there we go. Some exciting animation there. Makes you queasy, or it's just a framework. Okay, now on top of that, the Scottish Government have got lots of different tools at their disposal to try and manage this funding flows, but they're heavily constrained. For example, they cannot borrow in order to deliberately spend more money in a particular area. They can do that a bit on capital, so infrastructure investment, but they can't do that on revenue. So they couldn't turn around and say, well, we're going to overshoot our budget this year, let's borrow some money and pay it back into the future. They can't do that. They're restricted in what they can do there. They're allowed to borrow for some technical issues like forecast error, if the Fiscal Commission ever so often happen to get our forecasts wrong. Yes, it's one of the scars that we bear. So we get to borrow for that. Also have a reserve that they can put some money in if they need to carry money into preceding years. But again, that's heavily constrained, it's heavily restricted. And of course, if you're saving money this year to spend money next year, you're not spending that money this year. And that potentially means that there's going to be a constraint there. Okay, so that's all. Hopefully that gives you an overview about how you understand the fiscal framework, how it's become much more complicated. But it's really important to understand the different moving parts, because the budget can be determined not just by decisions here, but crucially by decisions in Westminster, not just on traditional public services, but also on things like social security and taxation and the like. So what's the overall outlook that the next Scottish Government will face when it comes into when it gets the keys for Bute House, and how much money is likely to be there for them to spend? So this chart shows you the outlook based upon the budget that was published last month in terms of funding for day-to-day public services. And when I mean day-to-day public services, I'm talking about things like education, health, and the like. So crucially, not at this stage, your capital investments. This is just money that funds universities, money that funds schools, hospitals, and the criminal justice system. And on the one hand, that's good news, it's going up. Okay, so funding for the next Parliament is going to be bigger than it was at the start of the new parliamentary terms, rising by about 15% in cash terms. But if you look at what's happening in real terms, so that's once you adjust for inflation, the growth over the next 5 years is only going to be just over 5% in total. So in other words, year on year, the Scottish budget is only going to grow by around about 1% in real terms. And that's not a lot of money. That's exceptionally constrained in terms of spending outcomes. And I'll show you about what the implications of that when we come to look at how the government have allocated the spending elements. But 1% real terms growth is not significant growth over a period of time. The capital budget is even more challenging facing the next government. So this is the same chart, just showing you the cash terms changes in the capital budget and what happens once you adjust for inflation. The purple one is nominal, the green is real terms. And you see that between this year and next year, the capital budget rises. This is the last year of the big investment by the UK government that they'd planned to do around supporting the economy. But after that, it falls away year on year, such that by the end of the next Parliament, the government that will exist will have less money to spend on infrastructure in real terms than when they started off at the start of the parliamentary term. So the funding that's available for roads, schools, hospitals, all those sorts of things is projected to go down in real terms over the next 5 years. So our government coming in, promising lots of new investment, promising lots of new activity, is going to face less money over the course of the Parliament than they will do when they start off. So that's, again, an exceptionally difficult funding outlook for that. And why is that the case? So some of it comes back to the very first piece I showed you around the block grant and what's happening to the block grant. The UK government is under significant fiscal pressure. The fiscal framework, the fiscal rules the government have set themselves are constraining day-to-day expenditure. That means that there's less coming through the Barnett formula than otherwise would have been the case. On social security funding, again, plans to try and limit the flows of funding coming into social security means that less money is, or at least not significant growth, is always coming through on social security. And more generally, and I'll show you a chart looking at the economic outlook, the economy is not generating a lot of tax revenues, both in Scotland and the rest of the UK. So your ability to fund public services through a buoyant tax base is particularly constrained, and that's largely determining what's happening to the funding outlook. Okay, so that hopefully gives you an overview about A, how the budget works, and then B, how the funding outlook looks for whoever wins the election in May. So what are some of the pressures that the next government will face in trying to essentially balance ambitions and promises they might want to make alongside those quite difficult funding outlooks that are going to exist? So the first challenge, I think, or the first issue the next Scottish government will face is about growing the economy and turning around the economy and boosting growth. And I said that really matters for several different reasons. It matters for the ability to generate tax-rich growth, but also crucially matters for some of the outcomes that the Scottish government are trying to achieve. And the next chart, I think, I'll explain it, but it's probably one of the most, quite sobering charts that we published in the Fiscal Commission that was buried away in the detail within one of our annexes. And I was kicking myself when I realised that actually we hadn't published it early on in our report, because I think it really highlights one of the big challenges that the next Scottish government is going to face. So actually this looks at the relative growth in disposable income in households in Scotland, going all the way back to the start of devolution. So essentially what that is looking at is essentially how rich what's the relative improvement in income of the average household in Scotland over time. And I've broken it down into different time periods. And the first very tall bar there is the average annual growth in disposable income for households in Scotland in the first 10 years of devolution, up to the financial crisis. So during that time, households in Scotland were seeing a real terms improvement in their living standards of around about 3% a year. So every 3 years or so, you were having a 10% improvement in your living standards. And that was supporting new investment in public services, it was supporting higher wages, it was helping to tackle child poverty, and so on. But look what's happened over the last 15 years or so since the financial crisis. So the average real terms growth in real disposable income, so household income, has fallen from nearly 3% to less than 1% over the last 15 years. And if you look at the projections that we're making going forward, and the most recent data we have, that growth is still less than 1%, even less than 0.5% annual growth year on year over the next few years. So we've essentially got an economy that is not creating wealth, it's not creating income for households, it's not created income, much income for households over the last 15 years. So when we talk about rising inequality, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about lack of investment in public services, that's the key driver for why all those outcomes are being delivered. It's our economy's inability to create wealth and economic opportunity. And the next government, when they come in, is going to face not only 15 years of relatively weak growth and dealing with the consequences of that, projections are that that's going to continue over the course of the Parliament. So how you turn around the economy, how you improve economic growth is going to be one of the big key questions, or the key to-do list for the next government coming in. So that's on the economy. So that's one challenge that they're going to face. What about on taxation? So now the Scottish Government has got all these additional powers that it can now use, whether it be on stamp duty, land and building transactions tax, or whether it be on income tax. And a bit of a recap about what the Scottish Government has done since they've gained these powers is that in general, the tactic has been to do some modest changes at the lower end of the tax distribution in order to make the liabilities for taxpayers in Scotland ever so slightly smaller than in the rest of the UK. But then beyond that, what happens is that taxes start to rise much more quickly. And the increasing tax liabilities as you move up the tax distribution. And that happens on income tax, which I'll show you, but also on things like stamp duty as well. So if you buy a house in Scotland that is, say, £140,000, you're exempt from paying any tax on that. You'd be paying tax if you were in England on buying a house like that. But in Scotland, you start paying a 10% rate of essentially stamp duty on a property above £325,000 in Scotland, but you don't move to that rate in England until you're paying £925,000. So if you're buying a relatively cheap property in Scotland, you're going to pay less tax. If you're buying a more expensive property in Scotland, you'll typically pay more tax than you would do in England. And that's a feature that is maintained not just on the stamp duty, but also through into income tax as well. And what the Scottish Government have done is implemented a much more progressive income tax system, but also a more complicated income tax system relative to the rest of the UK. So we now have 7 bands in Scotland compared just to the basic rate, the higher rate, and the top rate in England. We now have a starter rate, an intermediate rate, a basic rate, a higher rate, an advanced rate, and a top rate. So we've got now many more tax rates that now exist in Scotland. But it's quite interesting is that the government have raised rates much more significantly at the top end, but that has not been the core source of revenue growth. The key source of revenue growth has come through something called fiscal drag, where what the government have done is essentially frozen thresholds at a lower level. So as you earn more, as you get a pay award, as your salary increases, you move into higher rates of tax earlier than you do in England, and that means you end up paying more tax. And I'll show you a couple of pictures that show you that growth over time. Okay, so what happens to differences in tax liabilities between Scotland and the rest of the UK? So as I said, what happens in income tax for Scotland is that we've got these rates that make a slight marginal saving for taxpayers in Scotland at the very lower end of the income distribution. But then as you move up the income distribution, you start paying higher rates of tax and more tax on your income as you go. This just shows you the differential if you're between how much income tax you pay in Scotland versus how much income tax you'd pay if you lived in England or Wales. And you can see that the Scottish Government talk, and they'll explain about how the lower taxpayers in Scotland pay less tax than in the rest of the UK, up to the median income tax earner. So if you're earning about £20,000 in Scotland, you'll pay less tax than in the rest of the UK. If you can see that very small line there, that's how much tax you'll save. So you'll save the grand total of £40 per year. So it's, yes, so it lets the government say that you pay less tax in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. The maximum saving is £40. But what's quite interesting, if you move up the income distribution, particularly for people who are earning around about between £40,000 and £50,000, it starts to jump up and it starts to move up quite quickly. So if you're on £50,000 in Scotland, then you'll pay around about £1,000 more in income tax than you would do in the rest of the UK. £60,000 is getting closer to about £1,500. That's about 4% of after-tax income. So it's not a huge amount, but it's getting to the amount that people would perhaps notice it. And I think that's one of the interesting things about where the current Scottish Government have really set out their stall, and they've been quite clear in saying that they've made these changes to tax higher earners more, but they think they've gone as far as they will go at this stage in terms of trying to widen that differential between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So one of the really interesting questions for any future government coming in is that do they want to continue to widen that gap? Do they want to try and reduce that gap for higher earners, or are they quite comfortable about where it is at the moment? And that will be something I'm sure we'll see politicians talking about what their relative priorities are. That's an income tax. Now, so one thing I mentioned that always gets lots of attention is about whether or not people are paying a higher rate of tax. So in Scotland, you now pay the top rate of tax ever so slightly more than you would do in England. But the really fascinating thing that's generating the revenue for the government isn't actually changing the rates. It's about allowing fiscal drag to really get quite a lot of momentum over time. So the Scottish Government have frozen the threshold at when you move into a higher rate of tax much earlier than in the rest of the UK. So in Scotland, you now become a higher rate taxpayer at about £43,500. You become a higher rate taxpayer in England at £50,000. Crucially, they've frozen that level for a long number of years, and they plan to continue that over time. So what that means is that the number of higher rate taxpayers in Scotland is growing. So as people earnings improve, they're now moving into higher rates of tax. So if you go back to 2016, 2017, there were around about 300,000 taxpayers in Scotland who paid at least a higher rate of tax. So they might have also paid a top rate, but there were higher rate taxpayers in Scotland. Around 300,000 of them, of people in Scotland, of taxpayers in Scotland, were paying the higher rate. We estimate that essentially by this year coming, that over 600,000 taxpayers in Scotland, and by the end of the decade, you're over 900,000, not that far off 1 million people in Scotland, higher rate taxpayers. And that's the effect of fiscal drag. So that's people now paying 42 pence rates of income tax on their marginal earnings rather than paying 20 pence on their marginal rates of earnings. So the key revenue element of the government has come through more people moving into higher rates of tax in Scotland relative to what otherwise would be the case. So again, you're going from about 12% of taxpayers in Scotland being higher rate taxpayers 10 years ago to over a quarter of taxpayers in Scotland being higher rate taxpayers. And I think one of the interesting things, again, for the incoming government is that if you look at who is now a higher rate taxpayer in Scotland, that includes teachers, that includes police constables, it includes nurses. So it's people who might not have traditionally seen themselves as higher rate taxpayers are now higher rate taxpayers in Scotland. And again, one of the policy questions will be is how much further can you go in pushing more people into being into higher rate taxpayers? Okay, so that's a tax policy. What the government might do in terms of revenue here. So if you recall back when I had the spinning diagram, what mattered is whether or not the Scottish revenues are beating the block grant adjustments. So whether or not we're raising more revenue in Scotland than essentially being extracted from the block grant. And that's this so-called net position. So in other words, through the combination of the performance of the Scottish economy and the tax policy of the Scottish government, is that raising more revenue than essentially would be if we had implemented the same policies as in England. And this is what's happening to the net tax position. So it's positive. So it's positive in the sense that the Scottish government is collecting more in revenue than they would have done if tax devolution hadn't happened. So in other words, the tax revenues are beating the block grant adjustments. And we think that that's become positive. So the government are around about adding about £1 billion into the budget as a result of the tax policies they're making. So far, good news. Well, it's only partially good news because I mentioned there's two ways the budget can grow. It can either, the net tax position can grow and impact on the budget. One, because you're making more tax policy choices to raise money, or two, because your economy is outperforming the rest of the UK. And what we can do is we can work out, we can try and differentiate between the two. And essentially we can calculate, well, what would happen if Scotland's economy had been operating at exactly the same rate as the UK? And if we'd be collecting more money or less money. And unfortunately for us, we're collecting less money. So the purple line shows you how much money the Scottish government would be collecting with their tax policy choices implemented, and if the Scottish economy had been performing at the same rate as in the rest of the UK. And you see that the purple line lies above the green line. So in other words, there's a gap. There's a gap in economic performance and tax-based performance between the Scottish economy and the UK, and that's worth about £800 million a year. So if the Scottish economy had been performing at the same rate as the rest of the UK, the Scottish government would have an extra £800 million to spend. And that's another challenge facing the incoming government about how you can close that gap. And there's interesting questions about, whose responsibility is that gap? Is that the Scottish government's responsibility? Or is that a natural reflection of imbalances within the UK economy? Like it or not, it's there. And it's a gap that the Scottish government, future Scottish governments will have to think carefully about. One key reason for that gap is what's happening in the oil and gas industry and in the northeast of the country. And this is a calculation we did, which was like looking at the relative contribution of essentially the northeast of Scotland to Scotland's tax position. And because there's lots of high-paying jobs in oil and gas, because there's lots of supply chain jobs, lots of service sector jobs, that was actually boosting Scotland's revenue over time. It still is, but much less than it was before. So back in 2013-14, the premium, the income tax premium, so how much the northeast was adding relative to the Scottish average, was around about £700 million a year. Jump forward to the most recent data we've got, and it's much closer to about £250, £300 million. And there's a really interesting, again, pressure or challenge that the future Scottish government will face in that transition in oil and gas, that transition in the northeast, isn't just a global energy issue, it isn't just an energy issue for the UK, because we've got devolved income tax, and because income tax revenues depend on high-paid jobs, and because oil and gas are shedding high-paid jobs, the risk for that crystallises in the relative position that the Scottish government has got there. So that's income tax. What about social security? Social Security, as I said, the Scottish Government has done several different things. They've got increasing commitments in Social Security. I'll talk to you a bit about rising disability prevalence that's going on here, and then highlight two views that will kick in when we come into the next Parliament. So the first thing is that the Scottish Government is making more commitments, as it's entirely able to do, around Social Security. So it's becoming more expansive in some areas. It's changing the way that disabilities are delivered, which is encouraging more people to apply. And it's also implementing new payments that exist that don't exist elsewhere in the UK, such as the Scottish child payment. But what really matters is how disability prevalence is changing. And again, we probably heard this story, or you'll know a bit about some of the trends in the UK, but the numbers in Scotland are really interesting about that growing inflow into these payments that are now devolved. So this is the caseload, so the number of people who are on adult disability payment in Scotland. So this is the main payment for adults with a disability that exist here. Back in 2020, 2021, around 300,000 people in Scotland were on adult disability payment. That's now up to over 500,000 people. So a 100,000 increase in people on adult disability payments over the last 5 years. We're tracking around about 10,000 applications a month for adult disability. Pre-COVID, that was about 5,000 a month. So the prevalence and the people flowing into these payments is increasing at quite a significant rate. Perhaps even more worrying is what's happening on child disability payments. So back in 2020, 2021, there was just under 50,000 children in Scotland who were in receipt of child disability payments. Most recent data suggests that that's over 100,000, so a doubling in the number of children under 18, who are now receiving disability payments within Scotland. So one of the big challenges the government will face, the next government will face, is essentially a growing inflow, a growing number of people claiming disability payments. Now that might be a positive thing in the sense that you're now better detecting people who are entitled to disability payments. It might be reducing stigma, but it comes with a fiscal cost, and it becomes with a fiscal commitment that has to be made. What matters, of course, is about how this impacts in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. And as I said, the Scottish Government has implemented quite a different way of delivering these disability payments in Scotland compared to how DWP have historically done it. So it's much more supportive, it's much more inclusive, it's much more about encouraging people to apply. The award reviews, so how you review your entitlement to a payment, is much more supportive. It's not as intrusive as it is in the rest of the UK. There's a review going into that at the moment. There's some recommendations that have come out that are urging the Scottish Government to go further, and be more expansive in terms of its coverage. And we'll wait the TIMS review in England and Wales, which, as you recall, the UK Government promised to reform, or said they were going to reform welfare payments, and then rolled back. Again, the nature of our framework means that both of these elements will have an impact on the Scottish budget. If the UK Government tries to save money in Social Security in England, that will reduce funding through the block grant adjustments. If the Scottish Government chooses to spend more money on the adult disability payments, it's essentially got to find the revenues there. And there's a really interesting chart here, just shows you the different prevalence and different number of people receiving the equivalent disability payments by different age band between Scotland and England and Wales. The solid line here just shows you essentially the most recent data we have going back to February 2025, compared to the dotted line, which was the same thing in February 2020, and the orange lines or the yellow lines are for England and Wales. And a couple of things are interesting. So firstly, you see that both the solid lines are above each other, so above the dotted line. So in other words, disability prevalence is increasing in Scotland and the rest of the UK. But if you look closely, the gap for Scotland, particularly for older people, is now much higher than it was back in 2020. And that then means that there's then a funding implication for the Scottish Government in how they then deliver that and how they choose to essentially pay for that over time. So the next government has now got much more flexibilities over social security, but they've also got to think about the fiscal implications of that as well. And the more you put into supporting social security, then you've got to think about how that's then going to be funded from elsewhere. So the final thing just really to talk to you about then is what's the net impact of all of that so far. And remember I mentioned you get the block grant adjustment funding for social security that you're making in England and Wales, and then you can decide to top that up, or you can potentially save money relative to where the funding flows. And because that number is bigger, because that gap is bigger, and more people are now flowing in Scotland, and you've got these additional payments, like the Scottish Child Payment, there's an extra fiscal implication for the Scottish Government of around about £1 billion, £1.2 billion each year. That's an additional £1.2 billion the Scottish Government has got to find from within its budget to account for the increased commitment made in social security. So, just to start to conclude about what does this mean for the overall spending outlook for the Scottish Government, what does that mean for the choices that they can make? So let's put a couple of things together in all of this. So you recall that chart is the real terms growth in day-to-day expenditure. That's growing by 1% roughly year on year. So that's relatively weak growth. You then think about, okay, how are you going to allocate that spending growth over time? So you then think about what are the big ticket items you might want to focus upon. So this is the Scottish Government's share of spending that they've got. So health and social care makes up nearly about 40% of the overall Scottish budget. Local government, just over 20, about 25%. Social justice, so that includes the social security elements I'm talking about, and then all the various other bits that flow down there. So the obvious thing is that if you choose to make commitments in some of these big ticket items with a relatively weak growth in funding, then you're going to have to think very carefully about where that money comes from, either from taxation or from other areas within the budget. And increasingly, once you account for social security, remember I said that the budget was growing by about 1% in real terms. Once you account for social security and you look at how much is left for day-to-day public services, the growth isn't actually 1%, it's actually 0.2% next year. It actually declines a year after, and then it's just a growth of 0.6% the year after that. So in other words, the Scottish Government, once it's made its commitments in social security, and you see that additional spending that they now need to make, essentially the budget for all other aspects of day-to-day public services is under quite extreme significant pressure. Next year, it's only getting growth of about 0.2% in real terms. It's been cut the next year. So what have the current Scottish Government said about their spending priorities within that, and what will the next government inherit? So, if you've got very weak growth in your overall budget, so growth of 1% in total on your resource budget, but you're putting more of that money into social security, so there's less everywhere else, then any choice that you make is then going to not just be to spend more money in some areas, it's about where you're going to make some savings elsewhere. And the government published a spending review alongside their budget. And what they did was essentially set out where they want to spend the money, where they intend to spend the money over the next 3 years. And you can see some interesting trends here. So there's the social justice budget. So that's the social security budget increasing. But also, again, the commitment they've made repeatedly around more money for health and social care. So more money for the NHS, more money to pass on the Barnett consequentials of healthcare, to invest in tackling pressures, backlogs in the NHS. If you do that, health being the largest budget, overall real terms budget increasing by a very small marginal amount, it means that everything else gets squeezed, either by very limited growth, or in the case of local government and areas such as education and skills, you have to find real term savings. Now, largely, and this is one of the key points that we make, is that we think a lot of the time about policy driving budgets. This is largely about budget driving policy. If you have a very limited overall growth in your budget, and that limited growth is essentially taken by your commitments you're making in social security and also in health, it then means that everything else has to adjust. It's simple arithmetic in order to make the budget balance, because the government can't borrow. Everything has to add up. So more money in health means you have to make savings right across the board there. Now, this is the current Scottish Government's plan. So the obvious thing is a new government could do something different. But the funding envelope isn't really going to radically change unless you want to do something significant on tax. But as we said, there's a limit, perhaps a limit in how far you might be able to go. And in order to free up money in other areas, you have to take it away from somewhere like health or social security. And again, how popular is that going to be? Or how easy is that going to be when you face the pressures that we all know that are coming? So to give you just an idea about some of the issues there and why does health get expenditure much more, and why one of the big areas that the next government is really going to have to face is this is the average spend that you're expected to get on health as you become older. Now I always have to caveat that with this to say is that the fact that we're all getting old is a really good thing. And it's great that demographics are meaning we're now able to live much longer. But on average, it does cost the NHS more as we age over time. And you see that. So typically, once you get to your teenage years, all the way up until your kind of mid-60s or so, the average cost to the NHS bounces around between about £2,000 and about £4,000 per person. But as you move older, as we get older, then the average cost of treatment increases, and therefore you have more commitments to make. And the challenge for Scotland, particularly starting in the time of the next Parliament and moving through over the next 10 years, is our share of the UK population that is above the retirement age is going to increase. And it's going to increase relatively rapidly up until the late 2030s. And then it will start to tail off as the rest of the UK catch up with us. So one of the challenges that, again, the next Scottish Government is going to face is essentially the fact that our demographics are aging, and there's going to be a more rapid aging in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK, which means that there's going to be more commitments just to deliver the same level of healthcare services for the fact that we have an older population relative to in England and Wales. But that framework I told you and I walked you through says nothing about age. There is no protection in there for the fact that Scotland's age demographics are going to be different. So as we take on an ever-increasing share of the UK's elderly population, we're going to have to do that with a funding envelope that doesn't reflect that is happening. And that's why more and more money, even just to remain still, will have to go into the healthcare system in order to deliver at the same level of service. So a couple of final things just to finish on before we open it up for any questions and comments, is that one of the interesting things the government have done is that they've started to be much more honest and much more upfront about the potential savings that are needed to be made in order to balance the commitments that they have in there. So they announced £1.5 billion worth of efficiency savings that are to be taken out over the next 3 years. 1 billion of those are planned to be in health. The government are also talking about cutting back on the public sector workforce. They're planning to lose about 13,000 jobs in non-frontline workers over the next 5 years or so. To give you just a sign about how challenging that could be, or how different that could be relative to what we've had in devolution, this just shows you what's happened to the workforce since devolution. So it's consistently gone up over time. So the fact that the government are now talking about removing public sector workforce, taking out 13,000 non-frontline workers, is a departure from the trend that we've seen over the last 25 years or so. And it'll be really fascinating to see how easy, how straightforward that is to do in order to scale back the size of the public sector workforce. So public sector workforce is something they plan to do. Public sector pay is another area where they're going to focus upon. It's a really interesting thing where the government have a public sector pay policy, which is set for 3 years. So they set it last year, so we're now in year 2. And that pay policy was 9% over 3 years. We're in year 2 and they're at 8%. So again, hopefully it's not too difficult to work out that means that they have to have a pay award next year of no more than 1% cash in order to maintain their pay policy. So in other words, a real terms cut in public sector wages next year. We highlight that as a risk. In our report, we didn't actually, we departed from that in our modelling and our analysis and said, and use a different assumption. But why that's important, again, thinking through for the next government coming through, is that half the Scottish Government's budget, so half the budget that Scottish Government and local government have, is pay. So if you're going to pay more in pay awards, and your overall budget is only going up 1%, the other half of your budget has to make the adjustment and take up the slack. And I guess the question I pose there is, how will all that be delivered while you're protecting frontline services? So just to conclude on that kind of whistle-stop tour around the budget, some of the big challenges that are coming down the line, it's quite clear, based on, unless something dramatic happens, either at the UK level or the new Scottish Government really wants to do something different on taxation, that the funding element of the budget is going to be exceptionally constrained over the course of the next Parliament. There are things on the horizon. Clearly, the UK general election in 2029 might start to change the dynamics in there. Pattern of reserve versus devolved spending. There's a lot more money going into things like defence. That doesn't flow through to the Scottish budget. Again, if that continues, that's potentially going to be quite a significant risk there. And then the trends I mentioned about tax revenue and social security, like, does Scotland continue to depart from the rest of the UK, or we continue to be aligned? And I guess the broad conclusion when you're reviewing the manifestos for parties, and you're looking at what politicians are promising in the run-up to the election, with that funding envelope, with the constraints of the fiscal framework, then any big spending commitments, any new promises, are essentially going to have to be funded by changes elsewhere. Somewhere else in the budget is going to have to pick up the slack in order to pay for these significant new commitments and pressures. And with that, Chris, I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Great. Me figuring this thing out is always a problem.
It's not green.
There we go, got it. I did promise that Graeme would be very clear, which I think we can all agree was. I also promised he would be candid, which I suspect we're not quite as happy about in this room at this moment. Right, so questions. Here and then here.
Thank you very much for that. Also, brilliant exposition. Indeed, one of the things what happened before the 2024 UK general election is who really wanted to win the election. That's what I suspect it's some UK governments now feel that way. And the honest truth is, now who really wants to win the 2026 Scottish election. Three related points. One is a purely factual question. The bit of the Smith Commission tax proposals that's never been implemented was the proposal to devolve half the revenues from VAT, and what you can say about what has happened to that. The second thing, just trying to draw your social security bit and the taxation bit together in terms of what it's actually meant in terms of public policy. Is that my understanding, and I think most of what you said this evening, is essentially we're getting at the moment just under £1 billion more in terms of taxation, and we're spending just under £1 billion more in terms of social security.
Yep.
And then effectively what the Scottish Government has done with this freedom is to tax a lot of people who've got relatively high incomes in order to improve the welfare benefits, which were primarily for people less well. which is a quite dramatic, as it were, policy of transferring income. But you can see why it would make it difficult for a Labour administration coming into Edinburgh to begin changing things, because in a sense the Scottish Government under the SNP already pursued a policy that frankly no recent Labour government has dared to do. But one thing you didn't talk about is that, of course, you talked about the recent choices that have been made. But of course, there have been choices that were made in the early years of devolution, which are still in the budget. Free university tuition, free prescriptions, free personal care. This may be an unfair question, but can you give an indication as to, as it were, how much they are costing the Scottish budget? Because in a sense, somebody who's coming in is the government looking to see, well, what's our maneuver? Is it clearly whether or not these things are still quite affordable? Has to be part of the equation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thanks, John. So on the point about VAT, so the one other bit, you're right. In the Smith Commission was the recommendation that 50%, around 50% of the VAT that is raised in Scotland would be assigned to the Scottish budget. So they couldn't actually, the Scottish Government wouldn't change rates or bands, but what would just happen would be is they would basically, the revenue collected would then come in. And that was something that the Strathclyde Commission had originally recommended under the Scottish Conservatives proposal. And it was all about trying to give greater fiscal accountability, so that if you did well in the economy, your VAT revenues would go up. Therefore, you're then able to spend more money. If your economy does badly, the bit goes down. The problem with it is that it's just really hard to estimate VAT revenues that are collected in any one part of the UK. It's just impossible, because it's all done about business returns. You don't know where the money goes in. It's largely been kicked into the long grass for that. And I mean, I think the level of technical kind of developments that would be needed to go make it, I think, extremely unlikely, at least in the short term, that there'd be any plans to have any assignment of VAT. And my sense is there's not really any appetite for that to happen in a significant way. On the point about, yeah, you're right. So basically, purely from a numbers point of view, the government are raising pretty much £1 billion on tax, on their new taxes, pretty much £1 billion on social security. That has changed a bit. It looked as though the Scottish Government was going to have a bigger cost or a bigger commitment on social security until the UK Government reversed their reforms and personal independence payment, and then also when they didn't reverse, but they abolished the 2-child limit as well. So that's helped them out in that regard. So it's basically a like for like. And I think you're right, that then gets down to, if you're then prioritising, back to the I had about the spending, that if you're prioritising health, you're prioritising social security through your tax powers, because you've got an ageing population, because you've got challenges around how much you can invest in things like net zero, you then have to find other bits of the budget in order to make savings. And the government have talked about efficiencies. That remains to be seen about how you can actually deliver them. But the question comes, do you then now need to start to look at some of the big ticket spending commitments that governments have made in the past, and whether or not you're able to address any of them? But that's like the third rail of trying to grab in Scottish politics about whether you're going to do some of these big ticket spending items. And yeah, I think as I showed you with the demographics, the pressures on the health budget are only going to increase over the next decade as more money has to go into the health system.
Thank you. From somebody that knows nothing at all about the subject, it's very briefly mentioned, and I wonder if you could elaborate on what borrowing powers the Scottish Government has.
Yeah.
And as a supplementary to that, my understanding was that local authorities historically could issue bonds.
Yeah.
So could the Scottish Government, for example, tell local authorities to raise a lot of money from bonds that would take money out of the Scottish budget?
Yep. Yeah. So just quickly on the borrowing powers they have. So the Scottish Government can only borrow for two elements. One is on capital. So they can borrow about just over £450 million a year for capital projects. And they essentially are doing that and have done that over time. The challenge with that, of course, is that you have to pay that money back. And if you've got a really tight revenue resource budget that's not really growing very much, yes, you can borrow more money now, but the problem is that you then build in bigger spending commitments as you pay that money back over the next few years. So that's why the government have been slightly cautious about borrowing the full amount, because they know that they've then got the revenue commitments that come back on that. And that's basically the same thing for local governments as well. Local governments, you're right, under the prudential regime, can issue bonds, can borrow for various projects. But what they then face is the question that their repayments essentially are dependent upon how much revenue you get. And you saw the local government budget going down and pressures on council tax. It then means that their ability to make those repayments is significantly constrained. The Scottish Government do have a modest borrowing power on revenue, but as I said, it's mainly for managing cash flow and managing the budget process rather than anything significant. They can't borrow like the UK government can borrow.
Thank you. There's one back here, and then.
Thank you very much, Professor. I actually got two questions. So the first one is, when we go back to the previous slides, and I think there's one slide about 5% increase, real increase in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Just a bit curious. So how does this difference in estimate or predicted produce? So I suppose that we're making budgets for the next 5 years, like the number budgets, and then it's just, are we using the forecast inflation rate, or is it based on other source of information?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, so basically the nominal line is essentially once you put all those different elements of the budget together, so the block grant adjustments and the tax revenues, that gives the government its nominal outlook for the next 5 years. That can obviously change, as I said, to things like a new UK government could come in the future and spend more, cut budgets, etc., or policy could change in the relatively short term, but that's essentially the allocation they have at the moment, the number they're working to. The real terms are just using the forecast GDP deflator. So it's the Bank of England forecast that we'll use that then adjusts it for what that means in terms of its spending power.
Great, thanks very much for the illuminating talk. Two quick questions. One, in terms of the risks, which of course you highlighted the demographic risks, but you've spoken before, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission has highlighted climate change risks, which might impact Scotland more in terms of capital spending. I mean, all of these things did come out when we were discussing the Common Commission when you move away from historic allocation based on population, based on the changes, and instead start looking at need. And you do wonder whether at some point that whole thing has to be opened up, because to some extent, these are large risks. There's no single part of the UK can manage. And if the evolution were to progress in England, then you use some of the formula, the block grant, then again, these are not risks which any region in the UK can deal with. My second question is about, which follows on from John's, which is, okay, it's a third rail politics, it's not going to happen in the short term. But there are, just as a technical matter as opposed to a policy matter, there are fiscal implications if, for example, the Scottish Government said, well, let's start charging even a lower level fees for higher education, because that would come off the student loan system when you pay these are fees paid for the student directly, so they take loads of taking that. What's the fiscal implication there? Because of course it's not part of that grant, and it's sometimes been said by others that actually leaving some money on the treasury table by not taking advantage of those borrowing elements.
So on the first one, you're right. The interesting thing about this framework is it's designed to be set up to be very mechanistic, and that was something which was told as being a strength of this, is that you'd remove bargaining from it, you'd removed negotiation to be really clear about how this is going to be followed through. So the statement of funding policy will determine the block grant. block grant adjustments, as best as possible, are going to be transparent. You get the revenues estimated by us in the Fiscal Commission, so you remove any uncertainty or negotiation. The problem is that you're right, is that that implies that everything is mechanistic and you don't have any nuance in there. So there is no assessment of need, but there's also no real assessment of where coordination could actually be quite effective. So your example of net zero is a really good one, where the Scottish Government have ambitions around net zero, but they need the UK government to have the same ambitions, because money for capital investment in net zero comes through the block grant. So the Scottish Government needs the UK government to have the same agenda, but the UK government needs Scotland to hit net zero in order for the UK to hit net zero. We have a third of the land mass, we have most of the carbon capture, we have most of the trees that are going to be planted. But if you purely do that through a population share, a population share is much smaller than 1/3 of the land mass. So there's a question about, I think, in the rush to do something that's really mechanistic, because you don't want to have negotiation, that actually you lose cooperation, where you sit down and you say, how do we need to deliver net zero across these islands? What can you do? What can we do? Do you need some additional funding? And vice versa. And that's been lost within the design of the system. Yeah, and then on the technical point about the student loan stuff, so essentially that comes through a different part of the budget, so that comes through AME, and essentially within there would be fiscal resource that could be used that would essentially free up money within the spending commitments the Scottish Government have got. That would then flow through the AME system, that ultimately students would potentially pay that back. Any losses would be underwritten by Treasury. So there is, technically the opportunity for the Scottish Government to save money and transfer some of that risk, of course, onto students, but also onto the Treasury as well.
Thanks, Graeme. That was a really excellent presentation. One of the threads running through the presentation was the importance of performance in the Scottish economy.
Yeah.
Right back to your presentation of the components of the budget, and then looking at some of the challenges that we face. You said, I think, about priority for the Scottish Government is to grow the economy. And if you look at the anemic growth forecasts, you can understand why. But then if you look at the context and all the social policy, health policy, pressures, demographic trends, and so on, there are huge constraints. And I think on one of the graphs, the spending on the economy was almost invisible. So one question is, what conceivably, with policy levers at its disposal, could the next Scottish Government do to grow the economy that will make any difference, appreciable difference to their policy?
Yeah.
And then, in answering that question, maybe it helps to look back as well, because from what I recall, since devolution, growing the Scottish economy has been a priority for successive Scottish governments. In 2008, you were responsible. There was not the bar charts, but these graphs on the Scottish Government website, benchmarking the Scottish economy with the UK and other small countries in Europe, productivity, growth, birth rate, whatever it is. So, in thinking about the future, has the Scottish Government been able to make any appreciable difference to the growth rate? Historically, with policy levers at its disposal?
Yeah. So it's a good question. So I'll break it up into a couple of points, and given I'm doing it with the Fiscal Commission hat, I'll probably dodge some of the more thorny political questions. So a couple of things. So one thing that's really important, I think, to understand in this framework, and that sometimes gets lost, is that what is so important isn't just Scotland's economic performance, but our economic performance relative to the UK. And like it or not, but the Scottish Government signed up to this framework, was that it's all about that relative performance between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And that obviously brings up opportunities, because if you do things better, then you can outperform the UK, and that's great. But if you think about some of the big systemic risks or some of the big challenges in there, then you might pause to think about whether or not maintaining or matching the UK performance is something which is going to be easily done or readily done. As I mentioned, the UK comparison has the City of London in there. So that starts generating lots of high-income jobs, lots of bonuses, etc. Stamp duty, that Scotland's got to run very quickly just to maintain the pace with a UK economy that's got the City of London in there. I showed you the chart about oil and gas, well, the northeast of the country. That's a risk that is pretty asymmetric to Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. So if you're losing that premium over time, you then have to run fast elsewhere in order to maintain that. And of course, the Scottish Government has a selection of levers. It doesn't have all the levers. The UK Government have all the levers. The Scottish Government has a selection of it there. So there's interesting questions about the dynamic or the challenge that under this framework, even maintaining that relative performance of the UK isn't easy. That being said, there are obviously lots of things the Scottish Government could do if it wanted to try and grow the economy. So they've got very much the long-term levers of economic growth. So whether that be innovation, whether it be skills, education, turning around the health of our population, addressing labour market challenges, all those sorts of things are within the gift of the Scottish Government. We've done some work with my academic hat on, looking at the last 25 years of policy making in Scotland, and there have been some successes. We can point to individual ones where there's been Scottish Government and previously the Scottish Executive have made improvements. I think our general takeaway has been that a lot of it has been style over substance. So there's been lots of strategies, there's been lots of action plans, lots of stories about things we're going to do different, but it's really hard to put your finger on one particular unique policy decision that has been radically different from a policy decision that has taken place elsewhere in the UK that you could then point to a material outcome. We've got lots of examples where policy is different in terms of free tuition, free prescriptions, all those sorts of things. But in terms of like an economic lever that has been pulled, it is actually quite difficult to see, a coherent, clear example of one that is on a meaningful scale.
Right, I know we're pushing time, but we have just one more question on the list, so I think we can.
I'm a social worker at Glasgow Council, and it was just anecdotal, and it doesn't just relate to lower income families. Obviously, people have visa movement within the UK, we have an increasing divergence, social security benefit system, and we also have a divergent benefit system in other areas like free university education. So I wonder if the organisation of the Scottish Fiscal Commission has examined or done to examine the impact on population shifts within the UK to reflect that. Is there any evidence to support what we see anecdotally from the delivery of services, particularly dovetailing on that other policy changes by the Scottish Government, such as abolishing trade connection and homelessness? So, for example, Glasgow City Council is facing additional pressure. £30 million in the next financial year due to homelessness, more statutory requirements.
Yes, that's a great question. So we look at a national scale rather than at a local scale. So we see the things like in Glasgow, where there's additional commitments coming in through population flows. To be honest, the evidence is relatively inconclusive about whether or not the fiscal powers or the decisions are leading to population shifts. We hear a lot of anecdotal stories about that maybe at the top end of the income distribution, particularly in financial services, that it's maybe a bit more difficult to try and attract people to Scotland relative to competitor cities within the UK. Against that, though, we know that a lot of people value relocating to Scotland for not just the quality of life, but actually the public services that you get that are not equivalent elsewhere in the rest of the UK. So the free tuition, the cheap public transport travel. So the challenge is always there's both sides to the equation, and that will always differ for individuals. I mean, the interesting bit what the government have kind of talked about is that the differential, the differential, like at 50,000 of about £1,000, 60,000 about 1,500. They've paused at making that any bigger, which suggests that might be where their thinking is, that they might get to a point where actually that might be more challenging for them. So they've not gone any further. And for most people, you're not going to move, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but not many people are going to move for saving a few £100s. They're going to up sticks and move to Manchester just because you're saving £400 in income tax. But if it gets higher, then potentially that's where you could, at least from the empirical evidence, where the effect could be. The bigger effects I think that we think that you observe is less about people moving, but it's about changing their behaviours. So putting more money into pensions, working a day less a week, not doing the overtime. That's the sort of areas where you might get much more effects coming through. And we think that that's much more pronounced at higher ends of the income distribution than someone up sticks and moving somewhere else.
Right, thank you so much, Graeme. You've been exceptionally clear in talking us through all that, something that economists aren't often accused of, so we do very much appreciate that. And then a shameless plug for anyone watching online or anybody in the audience, when you start to tell people who you know about this lecture and you're trying to walk them through it, know that it's available on our YouTube channel, so you can just point people to that and say, trust me, you need to watch this in advance of the election to understand what it is that we're up against in this upcoming election. So can we please thank Graeme very much for
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Right, and we do have lectures coming up before too long. Certainly we have the Knowles Lecture in Political Philosophy coming up at the beginning of March, and we'll be pushing out our notifications about these in the usual channels. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.
I think we're going to book a session.